Okay, then. So, when we are talking about training in the preliminaries, the first instruction is to contemplate on the precious nature of this human birth, complete with its freedoms and advantages. And now, in contemplating on the human birth, complete with its freedoms and advantages, it is also important to reflect on the difficulty of finding such a birth, such a human birth. So, the previous discussions were the instructions on how to reflect on that. So now, at this point, reflect in this manner. That the fact that we have now taken birth as a human being in this life is due to accumulating the perfect set of causes and conditions in our previous life. By cultivating and accumulating these causes. Now, if we do desire to achieve a favorable birth in our next life, then it depends completely on our effort in this life, whether we will be able to achieve a favorable birth in the form of a human birth. And in Tibetan, we have a saying which sums this up perfectly. So in Tibetan, we have a saying which goes along the lines of, if you want to know what you did in your previous life, you need not look further than your present body. And if you want to know what you will, where you will be born in the future, then you need not look further than your mind in the present moment. So, in between, if you have any questions related to the discussions so far, they are welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. So the population is constantly increasing, like means that practitioners have accumulated the causes and conditions to be born as humans. And India has the highest population. And also India, based on our discussion, has all the personal and circumstantial advantages as well. So then why are we moving towards hedonistic pleasures and more unhappiness rather than practicing spirituality even when all the perfect conditions are there?
Tini morangi tiwa di diri, da nganzo ki tenjo nye kawa la jora, di eni ju pisun soba jila teni eni chungyo re song roas. Eni nganzo ki ta ngoye nesi la maa shibcha tanasira, eni zamling la eni mimbor teni nima na nima maro dugudos. Eni chidra do nganzo jaga ki mimbor la tana, eni ta maro shivu dugudos. Eni nganzo ki tenjo nyinga la jine jowa la jora. Jowa chubu de la pa samlo tana, eni jaga dawa neji la chenasira, ta jowa chu sama tsangin rawa ji chage doas.
제도 때 총선의 가르침을 자득 무드이 가르레스는 가시의 가르치는 이 밀리 지도와이는 신다라 가르레스 신디 시차 통수리 마도 주주비트 강강 주님에게 뭐가서 뭔지 그래서 다음은 시기 가시 온지 밀리 지와이나요 엄마 마송와 지 세바다다메 되게 되게 뭔지 온데기라 그래서 밀리 지와이 되는 주 메인 감이 이거 가시 대도 기타와라고 이나 아니 메인 감이 이제 가세 다도 다와이나
So this is not exactly true when we look at uh, even a land such as India. Even if there is a growing population, it is not the case that we cannot begin to make the blanket judgment that all of them have the advantages and freedoms to cultivate a spiritual practice. This is not the case at all. When we look at the population, there is a great great portion of the population who are not born in a time or a place or in an environment which is conducive to spiritual practice at all. And then similarly, when we are talking about personal advantages and so forth, there are a great number of the population, even though overall it might seem an insignificant number, but it's a large number of people who suffer through mental challenges, physical challenges, and so forth. So it is not indeed the case that even with the bludgeoning population, it is not the case that everybody has all these freedoms and advantages.
So, can I continue? My question is, the human birth you have is because of the good karma that you've done, and the causes and conditions have come together, and now you have accumulated this good merit. So why?
And it has already.
Like when you just have the rebirth and then, why is it not continued enough to? The merit does not continue enough to take you to a spiritual practice.
다 모기 지와 딜라게스 가지고 주편순 소바치다 두비어라스 레 게벨레사라 아니 텔라테네 아니 가지고 주편순 소바 두라 텔라테네 대조녀가디 토브라와스 아니 주기다 데불라 주디 데불라 미베기 참 다가랑라스라 주기 준디 체두기어라스라 주편순 사교 주편순 소바 사조지기 준지어라 체두기어라스라 주편순 소바 디스라 주마체바 아니 가지고 최 된도니와라라 가장 룩이요 말했어. 제가 너도 딩안속에 된존니까와 대스라 아니 레게와사 주편순 소바 둡라 데네 된존니까와 둡라와스 이나양스라 아니 대다왜 주편순 소바 디 균지라 주기 준디 데부 아니 된존니까와 디 토베 참라랑 아니 조르기요 베스라 아니 가르체산스라 아니 주마체바 아니 가서 최 된도니와라라 응원지요 말했어. 디부트.
나도 대차도 그러와. 기빠리 가르스는 리지 사비 집그 보통 소바다 보이나 하루기 가르스는 세기 집어도 지어라. 리가 딱 치는 데를 아니 그래. 딱 쳐본 가시 저거 얘는 리지기 들이치는 지와 맞잖아 팬데야. 준주기는 얘기해서 유리요 요즘에 미국이 리양 요즘이었어. 계속 딱히 가르스 제사비 리가서 제대로 리가 딱 치셔 따보라. 나도 배에 비디리나로 이나지 가르서 그러면 네가 주주 너무 그런 거 네가 그렇게 좋아서 세제도 그렇지. 근데 너희 비자사 비디가 지금은 네가 지정기 드리는 가시기 이 제제가 사니 미티기 주주라고 나는 다른 소도게. 그러니까 시기 지워 먹을 거 무슨 드려야 먹고 이쪽으로 와서.
So then this is understood when we begin to appreciate the characteristics of karma itself. So the manner in which karma manifests itself depends on the potency, the strength of the karma itself. So whether it be virtuous or non-virtuous, it depends. The result that manifests from these non-virtuous or virtuous or non-virtuous actions or karma depends on the strength or the potency of that karma. So it is said that there are virtuous actions or virtuous karma that one could accumulate which can impel and dictate our births for 500 lifetimes. And then similarly, there are also non-virtuous actions or karma that can impel and dictate our birth for 500 lifetimes. So it depends on the potency of the karma that one has accumulated. So a karma, there is such a thing as karma running its course. That's because the potency of the karma is now manifested completely in the form of a result. So if you need an analogy, you can think about a battery, a cellular battery. And the battery runs its course over time. And after a while, it stops working. So that's the kind of potency we are talking about.
소소는 노벨의 뭐 뭐지요나요. 소소가 되게 지와치마기 밀리기 되대야 누구도 있어. 대 소소 딱 거래 봐도 노벨의 되게 뭐 뭐도 세와이나 맞도 계산이 아니 개변지 거래서 이거 말아. 내가 노벨의 데이터는 초다 가서 뭐 가서 해줘야나 그런 가야라는 게 가리는 거지. 그 용문도 왔어. 제가 그런 지와치마 또 비딩 지수들이 주고 그래서 이제 제일 잡으라서.
So, rather than turning our attitudes towards looking at the ever-growing population and thinking about that and trying to relate this to our spiritual practice, it is more effective to turn the reflection towards ourselves, to understand the sacred and precious nature of our birth, and to make the best use of this human birth, because otherwise it doesn't have any bearing on our spiritual practice at all. It doesn't effectively help our spiritual practice at all, appreciating the ever-growing population, unless and until we appreciate the precious nature and the difficulty of finding such a birth ourselves. And even if we begin to think about it in this manner, it is important, I think, to appreciate the ground reality that in this day and age, even if there is an ever-growing population, there are places in the world wherein there is no spiritual teachings at all, one. Two, even if there are spiritual teachings, human beings are not really concerned about cultivating a spiritual practice at all. They are more concerned about material and worldly pursuit. So as such, spiritual concerns do not figure into their lives at all. And thirdly, even in this ever-growing population, there are many people, a big part of the population suffers with mental challenges, with physical challenges. And as such, when we develop an overall perspective like this, then we begin to appreciate the fact that we ourselves have all these freedom and advantages. So similarly, think about it in this manner and reflect upon it in this manner. That isn't it true that even if a large number of human beings are blessed with this 18 freedoms and advantages, do they really dedicate themselves to spiritual practice? This is not the case at all. It is a rarity that among the population that there are people who dedicate themselves to a spiritual practice. And even among the population who dedicate themselves to a spiritual practice, if we really look at it closely, it doesn't really qualify as pure spiritual practice. Their concerns are very much related to the concerns of this life, concerns of related to worldly concerns. And it's a very, very small population who pursue effective and pure spiritual practice with the concern about their next life, with concerns about far-reaching goals of enlightenment and liberation. So, isn't this true? So if we begin to realize, reflect on in this manner, then we can begin to better appreciate the rarity, the difficulty, and the rarity and difficulty of finding such a precious birth. Yes. Questions? To your Mr. No questions.
I have one more. What is the meaning of covetousness?
Tin napsim la jora. Odigi koa kariribes. Tunda. Nap.
나선 세야데 지기로 다 잘라다 보지 와이나 대용 알고도 달고 대용 알고도 세야데 아니 잘라지나 승차돼 지고 어디 가르쳐서나 나선 세야데 어디다 보자르는 딱 문부 지기로 통보됐던 거는 잘라니 지고 보지만 대연에 하고도 세야지 인류기 승차돼 지고 될 가르쳐서나 나선 나르사바샤.
So covetousness refers to that sense of attachment we develop to things, wherein we begin to objects, wherein we begin to think that it would be really good if I had that in my possession. So, for example, we can begin to experience the manner in which we covet things when we go to a marketplace, and when we look at the things on display, then we begin to develop the thought, it would be really good if I had this for myself. So that's covetousness. So now, as we have already discussed, the difficulty of finding such a precious human birth by reflecting on the difficulty of accumulating the causes for such a birth. Now we'll move on with our discussion on the difficulty of finding this precious human birth by citing and looking at some examples. And Geshe, one of the predecessors of the author of this particular text, he gives this example that if we are to reflect on the difficulty of attaining this precious human birth, then he uses this analogy or example that it is rare as the grass that grows on the thatched roof. So even though grass grows everywhere on the face of this earth, it is very rare for grass to grow on thatched roof. So bear in mind that this is a very classical analogy. It's an ancient example because if we relate it to this day and age, then it's almost impossible for grass to grow out of the buildings that we may build out of concrete and cement. But in the ancient times, they built a roof with thatch, and as such, they use this analogy. So rather than strictly sticking with this kind of classical analogy, I think it is much more effective if we are able to kind of reflect on our own immediate surroundings, on our immediate relations in our own families. And when we look around ourselves, maybe we can begin to appreciate that many of us, if not all of us, have these freedoms and advantages. But even if we have these freedoms and advantages as human beings, when we begin to look at it closely, it is very rare to find someone who is dedicating their human life to the cultivation of a pure spiritual conduct or pure spiritual practice. So then, the other classical analogy that Geshe uses is a very, very classical analogy that is found in the scriptures, wherein it looks at statistically how improbable it is. Even though statistically we can say that such a thing is probable, but realistically how improbable it is. So the analogy goes like this, that in the ocean there is a tortoise, and the tortoise is blind, and this tortoise only comes up out of the water and sticks his neck out of the water only once in 100 years. And there is a wooden plank with a hole in the middle, and this wooden plank is floating about in the ocean, and the probability of achieving a human birth is equal to that blind tortoise coming out in 100 years and his neck going through the hole in that wooden plank. So statistically, it's probable. We cannot say it's impossible, but realistically, it's improbable. So this is the rarity. This is the difficulty. So when we use such an example, it is a means to instruct us to reflect carefully in the manner in which we approach our spiritual practice, and how our practice and how that approach determines whether our spiritual practice is effective or whether our spiritual practice is pure or not. So we need to reflect, citing this analogy, we need to reflect back on the difficulty of accumulating the sets of causes and conditions that makes this human birth possible. So when we look at the how the foundational cause is pure ethical conduct, which is in turn embraced by the 6 great perfections, and which is sustained by pure aspiration and pure motivation. Now, this is the difficulty that it is referring to. So, when we relate this to ourselves, even when we say that we are cultivating a spiritual practice in this life, our concerns are merely related to the concerns of this life. We want to overcome suffering in this life. We want to make sense of suffering in this life. And even if we begin to practice spirituality, we want to overcome obstacles in this life. We want to be free from illness in this life. We do not even think about the next life, let alone thinking about the welfare and benefit of others. So as such, it is really, really difficult that we can bring ourselves to cultivate an effective and pure spiritual practice. So it is important that we bring ourselves to reflect personally on this, to look at ourselves, whether we are making the best use of these freedoms and advantages, and whether we indeed do have these freedoms and advantages. And based on the actions that we engage in this life, then it impels us to be born in our next life and effectively dictates and decides our birth in our next life. So, based on our own karma in this life that we have accumulated, we either are born in the lower realms as a hungry ghost, an animal, or in the hell realm, or if in the best case scenario, based on the karma that we have accumulated in this life, we are born in the upper realms as a human being, as gods and demigods. So with this kind of reflection, we begin to understand what exactly does spiritual practice mean. That spiritual practice, in a sense, is a process of inner transformation. So as such, the reflection should always be towards our own attitudes, towards our own behaviors, whether we have attitudes and behaviors that are negative, that accumulate negative karma, which can impel and dictate our birth in the next life. So in this, nobody can help us unless and until we help ourselves. So as such, the purpose of spiritual practice is to constantly observe our own attitudes, our own behaviors, to ensure that we are not engaging in something negative, and to be able to effectively transform our negative habitual tendencies by cultivating spiritual antidotes in its place. So if we do desire a good and favorable birth, as we are blessed with, as we are right now blessed with, then it is important we understand this, that the responsibility lies within ourselves, upon us, to cultivate our spiritual practice. That is the purpose of spirituality. Otherwise, if you begin to always look at others, reflect on other people's behaviors, attitudes, without any kind of consideration for your own behavior and attitudes, then that defeats the whole purpose of spiritual practice.
근데 소소는 바쁜 뭔가 차대와이나 아니 개인도 와서 비교하고 싶을 때 이런 것도 와서 소소라고 이나 화요 문제에서 소소 제가고 야고 뒤에서 와이나 소소 문제 보증 문제 매저 와라고 이나 아니 대단히 비교 소소라 용의 그래서는 용의 와라. 또 어떤 방식이 나로서는 가르쳐서는 가르쳐서는 로존이나 재판도이나 이 기계 수급이 가격이 내번 내저 요와이나 소소민이 밑에 두고에 제대로 소소민이 밑에 맞은 진이 좀 맞아 봐도 지요나 아니 제가 요와이나 대사는 수고라 행동하고 용으로 왔어요.
And this is a realistic approach or a realistic attitude that we can build towards our spiritual practice. And this is realistic when we begin to relate this to our worldly pursuits too. For example, you can begin to appreciate the prosperity of others, the wealth that others have accumulated, the money that they have, and you can appreciate it to no ends. But if you yourself do not take it upon yourself to become financially independent, and if you yourself are poor, then this doesn't help your situation at all. Then similarly, you can begin to appreciate the knowledge that others have, the qualities that others have. You can appreciate it to no end. But if you do not build and develop these qualities, gain these knowledges yourself, then it's pointless. So similarly, with regards to our spiritual practice, we can begin to appreciate the realizations, the qualities of our teachers, other practitioners, and so forth. But unless and until we take it upon ourselves to cultivate our own spiritual practice, then we cannot begin to see any results or benefits at all. And this, in turn, this kind of reflection helps us to understand the infallible nature of cause and effect, the law of causality. And there is a story that is often told when we are talking about contemplating on the difficulty of finding such a precious birth as this human birth. And it is said that at one point there was a teacher, a spiritual teacher, who was teaching on the same, advising his students to contemplate on the difficulty of finding the precious birth as a human being. And he was teaching in Mongolia at that time. So a Mongolian student began to retort in this manner that even though the Lama, even though the teacher repeatedly stresses this, I think that the Lama has not visited China at all. Because if he has visited China, he would begin to understand that there is an ever-growing population of people, human beings in China. And to that, the Lama began to reply that is not the point of reflection. That is not the point of contemplation. Even if you begin to understand and are aware of the ever-growing population in China, if you yourself are born in the lower realms in your next life, then this doesn't help your contemplation at all. So as such, it's more about turning the reflection towards your own personal attitudes and behavior so that it can help us to transform these attitudes and behaviors to effectively cultivate a spiritual practice. Then now, within the contemplation on the difficulty of finding such a human birth, we already talked about the difficulty in accumulating the causes. Then we also explored the difficulty with examples and classical analogies. Now the third one is the difficulty of finding such a human birth by its nature itself. So, reflecting on the nature herein refers to the manner in which human beings live their lives. So, when we look at the manner in which human beings go about their lives, they are entirely consumed by the concerns of this life, worldly concerns. So, as such, they do not really dedicate themselves towards a spiritual practice, let alone a spiritual practice. When we look at the actions that human beings engage in, we begin to understand that they engage in more non-virtuous actions than virtuous actions. So as such, it is perfectly evident that they are accumulating causes for birth in the lower realms, unfavorable births, than causes for favorable births. Then the Tathagata, the Buddha himself, instructed his followers in contemplating on the rarity, the difficulty of this, difficulty of attaining this human birth, by giving this example, that it is very, very, very rare. And when we look at the number of sentient beings who take birth from a favorable, when we look at the number of sentient beings who take birth in an unfavorable realm, the lower realms, from an upper realm, and then the number of sentient beings who transmigrate from an unfavorable birth to an unfavorable birth, then it's immeasurable, like the dust and particles that exist on the face of this earth. But when we look at the number of sentient beings who take birth from an unfavorable realm to a favorable realm, and when we look at the number of the sentient beings who take birth from a favorable realm to a favorable realm, then it's very, very few and far in between, just as the speck of dust that the Buddha might collect on his fingertips when he touches the ground. So it is said that the large portion of the population of sentient beings actually do suffer in the hell, in the hell, animal, and hungry ghost realm, and it is only a small population of sentient beings who take birth in the upper realms, infavorable births as gods, human beings, and so forth. So I think it will suffice to conclude our discussion on the first point of contemplation in training in the preliminaries, contemplating on the difficulty of attaining this precious human birth by reflecting on the difficulty of accumulating the causes, by reflecting on the difficulty of attaining such a birth through examples or analogies, and then by reflecting on the difficulty by reflecting on the nature of human life itself. So now we will move further along with our discussion in training in the preliminaries. So the second set of contemplation is related to death and impermanence. So herein, when we say that we need to contemplate on death and impermanence as a part of training in the preliminaries, contemplation herein refers to remembering death and impermanence. And now, in this contemplation, we begin to initially look at what are the drawbacks or what are the negative consequences of failing to appreciate impermanence and failing to remember death and impermanence. Then, as opposed to that, we begin to contemplate on what are the benefits of reminding ourselves of death and impermanence, and then based on these and how to effectively cultivate our how to effectively contemplate on death and impermanence in our lives. So, with regards to the first, which is the drawbacks drawbacks of the failure to remember death and impermanence, there are 6 points we need to contemplate on. So if we fail to remember death and impermanence, then even if we say that we are cultivating a spiritual practice, we will be entirely consumed by the concerns of this life. So our spiritual practice would not be effective to help us in our next lives. So in the first point of contemplation, if we fail to remember death and impermanence, even if we do cultivate a spiritual practice, we will only be concerned about the food we eat, the clothes that we wear, or gaining some sense of fame, prestige, status in this life only. That will be the extent of our concerns, even if we cultivate a spiritual practice. So, as opposed to this, we need to remember death and impermanence so that we can cultivate an effective spiritual practice which can help us in the next life too. So, if we are to make sense of this, we can try to relate it with this example, that if you have to travel far, then it makes sense to prepare beforehand, to take into account the distance you have to cover, the time it takes to cover that distance, and to prepare yourself mentally and with your provisions and so forth. So unless and until you never remind yourself, unless and until you are not aware of the distance you have to cover, the time it takes to cover that distance, then you are ill-equipped to travel and reach your destination. So similarly, reminding ourselves of death and impermanence is preparing ourselves. So then, second is that we are not mindful, that it doesn't figure into our memory to cultivate a spiritual practice that can help us in the next life if we fail to remember death and impermanence. So, when we say that we have to remember death and impermanence, it doesn't mean that we understand that at one point we have to die. This is not what we mean. Even if we do appreciate this, if we live our lives in a manner in which we live our lives in a manner in which we are mindless about our behavior and attitudes, we are mindless about our motivations, and as such, then when we face death, at that point we become helpless, and we only have an intense sense of regret that we are not able to dedicate our energy, dedicate our effort to an effective spiritual practice. So at that point, remembering death and impermanence is not helpful at all. So it is important to remember death and impermanence in our daily lives. Now, the third is if we fail to contemplate and reflect on and remember death and impermanence, then even if we cultivate a spiritual practice, even if we pursue spirituality in this life, it wouldn't really become an effective practice. It wouldn't really become a pure spiritual practice. So this is particularly true with spiritual practitioners. If they are not careful, then their whole spiritual practice becomes tainted and contaminated. In the sense that even if you say that you are cultivating a spiritual practice by studying the teachings, contemplating on these teachings, and then meditating on these teachings, then if your concern is a selfish concern and related only with this life, even the concerns that you have about your spiritual practice is simply related to gaining fame, gaining status in front of others' eyes, that you have all these spiritual knowledge and so forth, and spiritual training, then it doesn't really qualify as pure and effective spiritual practice. And if we really look closely and honestly in the manner in which we as human beings approach our spiritual practice, then it is really, really encumbered by these selfish concerns. It's very narrow and it's very constricted in its scope, because even when we say that we are practicing meditation, even if we say that we are making offerings to the Buddha, even if we say that we are practicing generosity to others, we do these kind of things motivated by a selfish concern. That if you are a businessman, you begin to think that with the virtue that you accumulate, with the karma that you accumulate from engaging in this kind of activities, you begin to pray that your business does well. And if you work or have any other jobs, if you are a normal person, then you also begin to engage in this kind of activities in the hope that with the karma that you have accumulated, that you face no obstacles in your life, that you face no challenges in your life. So this is the kind of narrow and constricted manner in which we approach spirituality. So it is important to understand that these activities, on the outset, spiritual in its nature, but from the inside, totally consumed by selfish concerns of fame, gain, status, and so forth in this life, does not really qualify as pure and effective spiritual practice. So, for us to cultivate a pure and effective spiritual practice, then at the least we should overcome that attachment that we have towards the concerns of this life and be able to dedicate our merits and our virtues to our next life. So now, the fourth point of contemplation on the drawbacks of failing to remember death and impermanence in our lives is that the drawback of losing enthusiasm in our spiritual practice, becoming very even if we say that we are cultivating a spiritual practice, if we do not reflect on death and impermanence from time to time, then it is liable that we become less enthusiastic. We become very over time in dedicating our energies and effort to our spiritual practice. So, remembering death and impermanence in our lives helps us to become motivated to dedicate our time and effort to our spiritual practice rather than engaging in meaningless things. So it helps us to overcome that loss of enthusiasm, becoming tired after a while. So as such, it is important that we take courage and take motivation from our reflection of death, from our reflection on death and impermanence, to effectively dedicate our time and effort to spiritual practice. So if someone is really able to contemplate effectively on death and impermanence, then it will be the case that they are able to dedicate all their time and all their effort to spiritual practice. And there are many masters, ancient masters, stories of ancient masters who, through their contemplation on death and impermanence, were able to become motivated to dedicate all their time and effort to their spiritual practice. For example, there's the story of Geshe who didn't even bother to cut all the bushes and thorns that grew around his hermitage, who didn't even bother at all, because he wanted to dedicate all his time and effort to his spiritual practice. And then similarly, as we already discussed, there is also the story of the great Tibetan yogi saint, Milarepa, how Milarepa didn't bother to stitch a rope for himself, even when his followers gave him a piece of cloth. He just put on the cloth as it is, as it was given to him. So now, moving further along with our discussion, the fifth drawback of failing to remember death and impermanence is that we become impelled to engage in negative actions, and negative and non-virtuous actions. So this is particularly true, that if we fail to appreciate that appreciate death and impermanence in our daily lives, then we become totally attached to the concerns of this life. We become totally consumed by the concerns of this life. So as such, we do not guard ourselves from engaging in negative actions. So as opposed to that, if we remind ourselves of death and impermanence daily, on a daily basis, then we can begin to understand that if we engage in negative actions in this life, then the karma will manifest itself in our next life. So this helps us to guard ourselves. This helps us to develop the ethical restraint to not to engage in non-virtuous actions. Thus. And now the last of these points to contemplate on failing to remember death and impermanence is that the experience of death itself becomes one marked by intense regret. So, at the moment of death, one begins to finally understand that all these things, family, friends, prestige, status, wealth, prosperity, that consumed the whole of your life, at this point you have to part from it, and it does not help you one bit. So at that moment, you develop an intense regret, and you begin to realize that at that moment the only thing that helps you, the only thing that can help you, and the only thing that you can take into your next life is the spiritual practice that one could have cultivated, the good karmas that one could have accumulated, the good and altruistic activities that one could have engaged in. So as such, it is important that we ensure that our own experience of death does not manifest itself in this manner. And to ensure this, we need to reflect daily on our own death and impermanence. Shana marage. Konzula tiwado kashijite urlaisa. So with this, we will stop our discussion for today here. So then, for the purposes of the discussion session, then I am informed that maybe it might be helpful to have some sort of leading questions related to the discussions that we had so far in the day. So as a leading question, first I think it might be helpful for all of us in the discussion that you will have to first identify the 18 freedoms and advantages, and to reflect back on this and how to relate it to our own personal experience. And then, based on identifying the 18 freedoms and advantages, it is also helpful, I think, to reflect on the difficulty of attaining this human birth, as we already talked about how it is difficult to accumulate the causes, how it is difficult to attain with examples, and how it is difficult to attain when we look at the nature or the manner in which human beings live their lives. So to kind of make sense of these discussions with debate, dialogue between yourself, so there is more clarity. So the second leading question that I would give you is more of a personal reflection. Now, based on this discussion, we can begin to understand and appreciate the fact that with this human vessel, complete with its freedom and advantages, then anything that we hope to achieve is indeed possible. Any kind of worldly as well as spiritual pursuit that we might be inclined towards. But with that being the case, reflect to your own experiences that even though we have such a human vessel, what exactly are the challenges which makes the pursuit of something unsatisfactory? Whether our spiritual practice, whether it is with regards to our spiritual practice, or whether with regards to worldly pursuits too. What exactly is the most prominent challenge or obstacle that makes it difficult for us to engage the activity itself or to pursue the activity effectively? So I think this is also helpful. So